Picture this: you're a soldier storming a medieval castle, scaling ladders under a hail of arrows, when suddenly a torrent of foul, reeking waste pours down on you and your comrades. It's not just disgusting, it's deliberate, because in the brutal world of medieval warfare, castles weren't just fortresses, they were psychological battlegrounds where even sewage systems became weapons. Defenders didn't just rely on walls and weapons to break their enemies, they used filth to crush their spirits. This is the untold story of how medieval engineers turned something as mundane as waste disposal into a tool of terror, blending grim ingenuity with the art of war. At first glance, castle latrines might seem like a footnote in history, just a practical solution for sanitation. But dig deeper, and you'll find a masterclass in psychological warfare. Imagine the humiliation of being drenched in waste before even reaching the enemy's gates. The stench, the shame, the sheer degradation. It was all calculated to demoralize attackers, sapping their will to fight. Medieval defenders understood something profound. Victory wasn't just about strength, it was about breaking the enemy's mind. And what better way to do that than by weaponizing something as universally reviled as human waste? From hidden chutes designed to rain filth on unsuspecting invaders to strategically placed garderobes that doubled as defensive traps, castles were riddled with dirty secrets. These weren't accidents of design, they were cold, calculated tactics, and they worked, because while arrows and boiling oil could kill, sewage could humiliate, turning proud warriors into demoralized, retreating mobs. So buckle up, we're about to explore the brutal brilliance behind these forgotten tactics, revealing how medieval castles turned waste into a weapon as deadly as any sword. By the end, you'll never look at a castle's plumbing the same way again. To understand how sewage became a weapon, we first need to see how castles handled waste in the first place. Medieval engineers designed intricate systems called garderobes, small, private rooms built into castle walls with stone seats and chutes that funneled waste directly outside. These weren't just primitive toilets, they were carefully planned features, often positioned over moats or steep ditches so gravity could do the dirty work. The word garderobe itself hints at their dual purpose. It literally means wardrobe, because the strong ammonia fumes from urine actually helped repel moths, so nobles would hang their clothes nearby. Talk about multitasking, but hygiene wasn't the only priority. Castles were fortresses first, and every design choice had a defensive angle. Garderobes were often placed on outer walls or towers, with their chutes angled downward toward potential attack routes. At first, this was just practical. Why waste a good moat? But defenders soon realized these chutes could do more than dispose of waste. During sieges, they became a crude but effective way to harass invaders. Imagine scaling a castle wall only to have boiling water, or worse, pour from a hidden opening above you. It wasn't just about physical harm, it was about psychological dominance. The shock, the disgust, the sheer unpredictability of it all played havoc with an attacker's morale. What's fascinating is how these systems reflected medieval ingenuity. While we might think of the Middle Ages as unsanitary, castle designers were surprisingly advanced. Some garderobes even had ventilation shafts to reduce odors, and a few were built with removable wooden seats for easier cleaning. But when danger loomed, practicality gave way to cunning. Defenders learned they could drop more than waste down those chutes. Burning sand, quicklime, or even diseased animal carcasses turned garderobes into makeshift weapons. This wasn't just desperation, it was a calculated shift from sanitation to siegecraft, proving that in medieval warfare, even the most mundane features could become tools of terror. Sieges in the medieval period weren't just battles, they were wars of attrition, where time itself became the enemy. Attackers knew that breaching towering walls head-on was nearly impossible, so they settled in for the long haul, cutting off supply lines and waiting for starvation to do their work. But defenders weren't passive victims. They fought back with every tool at their disposal, even the most unexpected ones. When food ran low and morale plummeted, creativity became their greatest weapon. And nothing tested an attacker's resolve quite like the foul, degrading tactics that turned castle sewage systems into instruments of psychological torment. Think about the sheer desperation of a prolonged siege. For months, sometimes years, attackers camped outside the walls, enduring disease, hunger, and the constant threat of counterattacks. Their only hope was to wear down the defenders, but the defenders were just as determined to break them. That's when the garderobes stopped being mere toilets and became part of the defense strategy. Imagine being an exhausted soldier day after day, staring up at those imposing walls, only to have buckets of waste dumped on you without warning. The stench clung to your clothes and skin, a relentless reminder of your humiliation. It wasn't just disgusting, it was demoralizing in a way that arrows or boiling oil could never match. This wasn't just crude harassment. It was a deliberate tactic to exploit the psychology of warfare. Medieval commanders understood that breaking an enemy's spirit was just as important as breaking their lines. The shock of being drenched in filth, the shame of retreating under a rain of excrement, these were blows to an army's pride as much as its stamina. And in an era where honor and reputation meant everything, such tactics could turn even the bravest warriors into reluctant, hesitant fighters. Some historical accounts even describe besiegers abandoning their positions entirely after enduring repeated sewage attacks, proving that sometimes the most unconventional weapons were the most effective. What's striking is how this reflected the broader evolution of siege warfare. As castles grew stronger and siege engines more advanced, defenders had to think beyond brute force. They turned their entire fortresses into psychological traps where every architectural feature, even the latrines, had a hidden purpose. The message was clear: no inch of the castle was safe, and no tactic was off limits. For attackers, it meant facing not just physical barriers, but a relentless campaign to erode their will. And in the end, that's what made sewage such a potent weapon. It wasn't just about survival, but domination. The defenders weren't just holding their ground, they were proving, in the vilest way possible, who truly held the upper hand. The psychological impact of sewage attacks began with one crucial advantage: sheer unpredictability. Medieval warriors trained for sword fights, endured arrow volleys, and braced for scalding oil, but nothing prepared them for the horror of being suddenly drenched in human waste. Picture the scene: attackers massing at the base of a castle wall, shields raised against expected projectiles, when without warning, a putrid cascade pours from a hidden chute above. The shock alone was devastating. Unlike conventional weapons, this assault struck first at dignity, turning battle-hardened soldiers into stumbling, retching victims, their armor and clothing saturated with filth. Historical records from sieges like the 1333 attack on Stirling Castle describe besiegers abandoning their positions en masse after enduring these humiliating barrages. Why? Because the filth wasn't just physically repulsive, it was psychologically corrosive. In an era where honor defined a warrior's identity, being publicly defiled in such a manner shattered morale faster than any blade. Imagine the whispers among the ranks: how can we storm walls when they reduce us to laughingstocks? Defenders exploited this brilliantly, timing waste dumps to coincide with key moments, like the initial assault, to maximize chaos. Attackers expecting a heroic charge instead found themselves slipping on fouled ground, gagging from the stench, and scrambling back to camp just to scrape off the mess. The genius lay in the asymmetry of the tactic. While arrows and boiling oil required precious resources, waste was always in abundant supply. Some castle garrisons even reserved their latrine chutes as last-ditch weapons during dire sieges, knowing the mere threat could deter attackers. And it wasn't just about the immediate disgust. Prolonged exposure led to infections, with open wounds festering from contaminated filth. But the real damage was invisible. The erosion of camaraderie as soldiers mocked their soiled comrades, or the creeping dread that tomorrow might bring another degrading deluge. What's striking is how these tactics blurred the line between physical and psychological warfare. Unlike a clean arrow wound, sewage left no honorable scar, just shame. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War note besiegers preferring to face volleys of crossbow bolts rather than endure another reign of vileness. Because while pain could be endured, humiliation lingered, turning even the bravest fighters into demoralized shadows. Defenders didn't just win battles this way, they rewrote the rules of engagement, proving that sometimes the most primitive weapons cut the deepest. Beyond the immediate humiliation, sewage attacks carried an even darker psychological weapon, the specter of disease. Medieval people understood, long before modern medicine, that filth bred sickness, and castle defenders turned this primal fear into a brutal advantage. Imagine an army camped outside fortress walls for months, already weakened by scarce rations, when defenders begin flinging waste into their water supplies or over their makeshift trenches. The terror wasn't just in the stench, it was in the knowledge that every contaminated drop could bring dysentery, cholera, or worse. Historical accounts reveal how defenders deliberately poisoned wells with animal carcasses or fouled siege engines with excrement to spread panic. During the siege of Kaffa in 1346, for example, besieging Mongols catapulted plague infected corpses over the walls, an early act of biological warfare. While not strictly sewage, the principle was the same, exploiting the visceral link between decay and disease to break enemy morale. Even the rumor of contamination could spark mass desertions, as soldiers fled rather than face invisible, festering death. The genius of this tactic lay in its simplicity. Unlike swords or arrows, disease didn't discriminate. A single tainted water source could decimate ranks far faster than any battlefield charge. Chronicles from the Crusades describe armies abandoning entire campaigns after dysentery ravaged their camps, often traced back to defenders sabotaging nearby streams with waste. And the fear lingered. Attackers might hesitate for weeks, scrutinizing every puddle or food supply, their fighting spirit eroded by paranoia. What made this psychological warfare so effective was its inevitability. Medieval soldiers expected wounds in battle, but the thought of dying feverish and soiled in a distant trench struck deeper. Defenders amplified this dread, sometimes even taunting besiegers by shouting about the rot awaiting them. In the end, it wasn't just about infecting bodies. It was about infesting minds, turning the natural fear of decay into a weapon as lethal as any siege engine. In the medieval world, filth wasn't just physically repulsive, it carried the weight of profound symbolism. To douse an enemy in sewage wasn't merely a tactical move, it was a calculated insult, a way to strip away their dignity as ruthlessly as a blade could strip away armor. This was especially devastating for knights, whose entire identity revolved around honor, purity, and the chivalric code. Imagine a nobleman in gleaming armor, raised to believe his very soul was tied to cleanliness and virtue, suddenly smeared with waste in front of his men. The message was unmistakable. You are no longer a hero, you are refuse. The psychological power of this degradation extended far beyond the immediate disgust. Medieval society operated on a strict hierarchy where status was visible. Nobles wore fine fabrics, kept meticulously groomed, and distanced themselves from the filth of peasant life. So when defenders hurled waste from castle walls, they weren't just targeting bodies, they were attacking the very foundation of their enemy's social standing. Chronicles from the siege of Château Gaillard in 1204 describe French knights retreating in outrage after being soiled, not because of injury, but because the humiliation rendered them unfit to continue fighting. Their pride, not their bodies, had been wounded. This tactic spread like wildfire across Europe because it exploited a universal truth: shame cuts deeper than steel. In Germany, castle garrisons added rotting food to their waste mixtures, amplifying the stench and symbolism. In Italy, defenders timed their sewage dumps to coincide with enemy commanders' inspections, ensuring the highest-ranking targets bore the brunt of the degradation. Even the Crusades saw this grim innovation, with Muslim chroniclers recording Christian knights abandoning siege lines after being drenched in filth, their holy crusade suddenly feeling unclean. What made this so effective was its adaptability. Unlike siege engines requiring skilled engineers, any castle with a garderobe could weaponize waste. And while nobles were the primary targets, the tactic worked equally well against common soldiers. Disgust is a great equalizer. By the late Middle Ages, the practice had become so widespread that some armies began carrying makeshift shields made of oiled cloth, not to block arrows, but to deflect the dreaded rain of dishonor. Yet even these measures couldn't erase the psychological damage, because in the end, no armor could protect a warrior from the realization that his enemies saw him as nothing more than dirt to be washed away. The siege of Château Gaillard in 1204 stands as one of history's most infamous examples of sewage warfare, a brutal masterclass in psychological dominance. Perched high above the Seine River, the castle was a marvel of medieval engineering, but its real weapon that day wasn't just stone walls or archers. It was the calculated use of filth to break the spirit of England's finest. As King Philip's forces tightened their grip, the English army rolled forward with siege towers, confident their disciplined ranks would prevail. Then, without warning, the French defenders unleashed a torrent of waste from hidden garderobe chutes, drenching the attackers in a foul, degrading deluge. The effect was instantaneous. Siege towers, meant to be symbols of invincibility, became rolling disasters as soldiers slipped and stumbled in the sludge. The stench clung to their armor and banners, turning proud warriors into objects of ridicule. Chroniclers of the time describe English knights, men who'd faced battlefields without flinching, retreating in visible disgust, their honor stained as deeply as their surcoats. This wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a humiliation so profound it rattled the entire army. The French didn't just stop an assault, they shattered the illusion of English invincibility, proving that even the mightiest forces could be undone by the basest of weapons. What made Château Gaillard's defense so devastating was its precision. The French didn't just dump waste randomly, they timed their attacks to maximize chaos, targeting the moment siege towers reached the base of the walls. The English, trained to expect arrows or boiling oil, were psychologically unprepared for this kind of assault. There was no glory in dodging filth, no honor in retreating from a stench. And as word spread through the ranks, morale crumbled faster than the soiled siege engines. This event didn't just win a battle, it rewrote the playbook. After Château Gaillard, castle garrisons across Europe took note. The siege became a grim legend, a warning that no army, no matter how disciplined, was immune to the corrosive power of shame. The English eventually took the castle, but the stain of that day lingered far longer than the filth on their tunics, because in medieval warfare, victory wasn't just about conquering land, it was about conquering pride. And sometimes the most effective weapon wasn't a sword or a catapult, but the undeniable, degrading truth that even knights could be brought low by something as simple as sewage. The transformation of a simple garderobe into a siege weapon wasn't accidental, it required meticulous engineering. While all castles had latrines, only those designed with warfare in mind could turn waste into a tactical advantage. The key lay in subtle modifications that turned passive chutes into active weapons. Reinforced stone channels, for example, prevented clogging during rapid dumping, while angled outlets directed filth precisely where defenders wanted it, onto scaling ladders or siege engines below. Some castles even featured hinged wooden flaps inside chutes, allowing waste to be held back until the perfect moment, creating a gruesome surprise for attackers. The most advanced systems functioned like medieval plumbing traps. At Crac des Chevaliers, a Crusader fortress in modern-day Syria, garderobes emptied into concealed trenches that could be flushed on command during sieges. By removing a wooden barrier, defenders unleashed a concentrated wave of waste into enemy trenches below. This wasn't just improvisation, it was hydraulic engineering harnessed for psychological warfare. Similar designs appeared in Scottish tower houses, where spiral staircases hid narrow waste shafts that doubled as defensive features. Attackers climbing the stairs might suddenly find themselves showered from above, with no visible source for the onslaught. What's remarkable is how these adaptations reveal medieval builders' understanding of fluid dynamics long before modern science. At Château de Coucy in France, garderobe chutes were deliberately tapered to increase velocity, ensuring waste didn't just trickle out but erupted with force. Other castles employed gravity-fed reservoir cisterns normally used for water storage that could be repurposed to mix waste with quicklime, creating a caustic slurry. These weren't crude modifications but calculated enhancements, showing how seriously castles took this unorthodox defense. The real genius, though, lay in concealment. Many weaponized garderobes featured false masonry or decorative carvings that disguised their offensive capabilities until it was too late. At Dover Castle, archaeologists discovered latrine chutes hidden behind what appeared to be decorative arrow slits, a cruel trick that lured attackers into kill zones before unleashing filth from an unexpected angle. This level of deception proves that sewage warfare wasn't a last resort. It was a premeditated strategy woven into the very stones of these fortresses. Far from being primitive, these systems represented a dark marriage of sanitation and siegecraft, where every architectural choice served both practical and psychological ends. Moats have long been romanticized as gleaming barriers of water, shimmering under the sun like something out of a fairy tale. But the reality was far less picturesque, especially when castles weaponized them. Far from just being obstacles, moats became sprawling waste reservoirs, turning what looked like a simple water feature into a festering tool of psychological and biological warfare. Defenders didn't just rely on stagnant water to slow attackers. They actively polluted these trenches with sewage, rotting carcasses, and even toxic additives like quicklime, transforming them into revolting, disease-ridden no-go zones. The strategic brilliance of this tactic lay in its layered impact. An attacker approaching a castle already faced the daunting task of crossing a wide, water-filled ditch, but if that water was thick with human waste and decaying matter, every step became a gamble with humiliation and infection. Historical accounts from sieges like Harlech in 1283 describe moats so vile that scaling ladders slipped from soldiers' hands, their grips weakened by the slime coating every surface. Even worse, the stench alone could induce vomiting, while open cuts or scratches inevitable during an assault risked turning septic from the contaminated water. But the real psychological power came from the unavoidable spectacle. Unlike hidden garderobe chutes, a fouled moat was a visible, unmistakable threat. Attackers had to stare at it for days or weeks, watching flies swarm over the surface, knowing they'd eventually have to wade through it. Some besieging armies tried makeshift bridges or filling the moat with debris, but defenders often sabotaged these efforts by dumping fresh waste to maintain the hazard. At the siege of Kenilworth in 1266, chroniclers noted how the mere sight of the sludge-choked moat demoralized troops before the first arrow was even loosed. What made moats uniquely effective was their scalability. A single latrine chute could harass small groups, but a polluted moat threatened entire battalions. Defenders amplified this by timing their waste disposal to coincide with low tides or dry seasons, ensuring the filth concentrated rather than diluted. In coastal castles like Dover, tidal moats became natural flush mechanisms. Defenders would release sewage at high tide, letting the outgoing current spread contamination into enemy camps downstream. This wasn't just defensive, it was ecological warfare, turning the landscape itself against the attackers. The legacy of these tactics endured long after the Middle Ages. Renaissance fortifications continued designing moats with waste channels, and the term moat even entered military jargon as a metaphor for any insurmountable barrier, physical or psychological. Because that's what these fouled trenches truly were, not just pits of water, but calculated instruments of dread. They forced attackers to confront not just the risk of death, but the certainty of degradation, making every assault feel less like a charge to glory and more like a descent into filth. And in the end, that was often enough to make even the bravest army think twice. The stench of a medieval siege wasn't just unpleasant, it was weaponized. Imagine standing in the sweltering summer heat, armored from head to toe, as the air thickens with a putrid, choking miasma of human waste, rotting food, and animal carcasses. This wasn't just background discomfort, it was a deliberate assault on the senses, designed to break besiegers long before they ever touched the castle walls. Chroniclers of the time described smells so overpowering they could make seasoned warriors retch uncontrollably, their eyes watering, their throats burning. The 13th century monk Matthew Paris wrote of one siege where the odor was so vile, it drove men mad as if poisoned, with soldiers abandoning their posts simply to escape the unbearable air. What made this tactic so effective was its inescapability. Unlike arrows or boiling oil, you couldn't block stench with a shield or dodge it with quick reflexes. It seeped into everything: clothing, hair, even the food and water supplies. In summer, heat amplified the horror, turning stagnant moats into bubbling cauldrons of decay. The Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani recounted how during the siege of a Tuscan castle in 1338, the summer sun transformed the moat into a reeking hell, with attackers fainting from the fumes as they tried to advance. Defenders knew this and timed their waste dumps to maximize the effect, ensuring the worst of the stench coincided with the hottest hours of the day. But the psychological impact went deeper than mere disgust. In the medieval mind, foul odors were linked to disease and divine punishment, a belief defenders exploited ruthlessly. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it felt like a portent of death. Soldiers whispered that such air could curse the blood, spreading sickness through sheer vileness. At the siege of Rouen in 1418, English troops reported hallucinations after days of breathing air thick with the stench of corpses and waste, convinced the very miasma was sapping their strength. Whether real or imagined, the effect was the same: morale crumbled faster than the rotting refuse piling up outside the walls. What's striking is how universal this tactic became. From the Crusader castles of the Levant to the storm-racked fortresses of Scotland, defenders relied on sensory overload as a great equalizer. It didn't matter if you were a lowly foot soldier or a noble knight, stench spared no one. And unlike other siege weapons, it required no skill to deploy. Even a child could dump a bucket of waste over the walls, yet the impact could halt an army in its tracks. By the late Middle Ages, some besieging commanders resorted to perfumed cloths tied over their faces, but nothing could fully mask the olfactory onslaught. The true genius of this tactic lay in its lingering aftermath. Even after a siege ended, the memory of that stench haunted survivors. Chroniclers wrote of veterans shuddering at the mere mention of certain castles, their bodies recoiling at some long-faded odor only they could still smell. Because while wounds might heal, the brain never forgets the visceral horror of being trapped in an invisible, suffocating cloud of decay. Defenders didn't just attack the body with this tactic, they scarred the mind, turning the very air into an ally. And in the end, that was often enough to make even the bravest army think twice before storming those walls again. Water was life on the medieval battlefield, and defenders knew that poisoning a single well could cripple an entire besieging army. While castles stored reserves in cisterns, attackers had no such luxury. They depended entirely on local streams, ponds, or hastily dug wells, making these water sources irresistible targets for psychological and biological sabotage. Defenders didn't just dump waste randomly, they orchestrated contamination with chilling precision, turning every sip of water into a potential death sentence. Take the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade, where Turkish defenders secretly fouled nearby springs with animal carcasses and sewage. Within days, Crusaders were collapsing not from arrows, but from dysentery, their camps transformed into scenes of agony as dehydration and disease ravaged their ranks. The genius of this tactic was its invisibility. Unlike a volley of arrows, contamination struck silently, leaving attackers to wonder whether the next drink would be their last. Chroniclers describe soldiers staring at clear water, paralyzed by fear, while their comrades writhed in pain nearby. Thirst became a weapon, and every well a potential trap. Timing was everything. Defenders often waited until besiegers grew desperate after weeks of drought, or when supply lines were stretched thin before unleashing their foulest tricks. At Château de Chinon in 1226, French garrisons held back waste-filled barrels for months, only tipping them into the river downstream of enemy camps when summer heat made dehydration a deadly threat. The psychological toll was devastating. Attackers faced an impossible choice: abandon their positions or risk drinking poisoned water. Some armies resorted to digging deeper wells, but defenders countered by burying rotting meat in nearby soil, tainting the groundwater itself. What made this tactic so sinister was its lingering effect. Even after a siege ended, the fear of contamination persisted. Crusaders marching through former battlefields avoided pristine-looking streams for years, haunted by stories of invisible killers lurking in the water. Defenders didn't just win battles this way, they planted seeds of paranoia that outlasted the war itself. Because in medieval warfare, the most potent weapons weren't always the ones you could see. Sometimes they flowed silently beneath your feet, waiting to turn survival itself into a gamble. Medieval warfare wasn't just about brute force, it was a science, meticulously documented in manuals that read like twisted cookbooks for chaos. Among the most influential was Vegetius de Re Militare, a 4th century text that became the medieval commander's Bible. While it praised discipline and strategy, buried in its pages were darker gems, oblique references to using all means to repel attackers. a phrase later interpreters understood as tacit approval for weaponizing waste. This wasn't some fringe idea scribbled in the margins. It was formalized knowledge passed down through generations of siege engineers who saw filth as just another tool in the arsenal. What's fascinating is how these texts treated sewage tactics with clinical detachment. The Mappi Clavicula, a 9th century manuscript on military arts, included recipes for stinking mixtures to hurl at enemies, blending quicklime with rotting organic matter to create clouds of choking, nauseating vapor. These weren't the ramblings of desperate defenders, they were precise instructions, measured and methodical. By the High Middle Ages, such knowledge had spread so widely that even poetic accounts of sieges, like the Chanson de Roland, included veiled nods to black rains falling from castle walls. The message was clear. This was no longer improvisation. It was institutionalized warfare. The transmission of these techniques reveals a shadow curriculum of medieval military science. Monastic scribes painstakingly copied siege manuals, preserving grim innovations alongside loftier strategies. When the Crusaders brought back Arabic texts on siege engineering, European commanders pored over passages describing the use of corrupted waters to weaken enemies. This cross-pollination of ideas turned waste warfare into a refined craft, one where apprentices learned to calculate the optimal angle for a garderobe shoot or the precise moment to dump waste into a moat for maximum psychological impact. Perhaps the most striking evidence comes from personal accounts. The 14th century knight Geoffrey de Charny, famed for his writings on chivalry, grudgingly admitted that even the basest defenses could decide a siege, a thinly veiled allusion to sewage tactics. His contemporary, the engineer Conrad Kaiser, went further. His Belleforte's manuscript featured illustrations of siege engines alongside diagrams for stink pots, clay vessels designed to shatter and release noxious fumes. These weren't crude jokes, they were blueprints for humiliation, treated with the same gravity as catapult designs or wall reinforcements. The legacy of these manuals endured long after the Middle Ages. Renaissance military thinkers like Machiavelli still referenced medieval sewage tactics as cautionary tales about the unpredictability of war. Because while castles crumbled and swords rusted, one truth remained. In the calculus of siege warfare, even the most degrading weapons could tip the scales. And behind every bucket of filth dumped from the ramparts was centuries of accumulated knowledge, proof that medieval warfare's dirtiest secrets were also its most carefully studied. Even in an era known for its brutality, the use of sewage as a weapon sparked fierce moral debates. While some medieval commanders saw it as a stroke of tactical genius, others recoiled at what they considered a vile breach of battlefield honor. The 12th century chronicler Orderic Vitalis captured this divide perfectly when he described a Norman lord refusing to employ base filth against his enemies, declaring it unworthy of Christian warriors. Yet just decades later, during the Siege of Acre, Crusaders enthusiastically dumped waste on Muslim forces, arguing that survival justified any means. This tension between idealism and pragmatism reveals how siege warfare constantly tested the era's fragile concepts of chivalry. The Church's stance only deepened the controversy. While medieval clergy rarely objected to conventional slaughter, they drew the line at tactics seen as unnatural or unclean. Pope Innocent III once condemned defenders who poisoned wells with corpses as defiling God's creation, and similar language appeared in ecclesiastical bans against fouling water sources. What's revealing is the reasoning these weren't just complaints about cruelty, but about violating perceived natural order. Waste belonged in latrines, not battlefields. To weaponize it was to twist God's design. Some theologians even linked sewage attacks to demonic influence, claiming only Satan would inspire men to fight with excrement rather than steel. Yet for every moral objection, pragmatic commanders offered a counter-argument. The famed knight and chronicler Jean de Joinville wrote that during the Seventh Crusade, when dysentery ravaged both sides, his comrades saw no difference between dying from tainted water or arrows. Dead was dead. This utilitarian view gained traction as sieges grew longer and more desperate. By the 14th century, even noble-born tacticians like Bertre and du Guesclin openly advocated fouling moats, arguing that preserving lives justified any stench. The shift was telling. As warfare evolved, so too did the definition of honor. What makes this ethical clash so fascinating is how it mirrors modern debates about acceptable warfare. Medieval commanders grappling with sewage tactics faced the same core dilemma we see today, where to draw the line between necessity and morality. Some, like the Burgundian engineer Jean Hérode, sought middle ground, designing cleaner waste disposal systems that couldn't be easily weaponized. Others, like the mercenary captain Werner von Erslingen, proudly boasted of using every available advantage, filth included. Their arguments still echo in contemporary discussions of chemical weapons or drone warfare, proving that the tension between effectiveness and ethics is timeless. The legacy of this debate lingers in unexpected places. When archaeologists uncovered the garderobes of Crac des Chevaliers, they found some chutes deliberately blocked with rubble, possibly by defenders with moral qualms. Meanwhile, at Château de Coucy, graffiti carved by long-dead soldiers still debates whether a stinking victory is still victory. These silent testimonies remind us that medieval warfare wasn't just about physical conquest, but about the psychological and moral lines warriors were willing to cross. And in that sense, the humble castle latrine became far more than a sanitation feature. It was a mirror held up to the darkest corners of the medieval mind. Sleep deprivation became one of the most insidious weapons in the medieval defender's arsenal, not through blades or arrows, but through the relentless, demoralizing power of filth. Imagine trying to rest after a grueling day of siege preparations, only to be jolted awake by the splatter of waste raining down on your camp. Defenders didn't just attack by day, they turned night into a battleground, exploiting darkness to amplify fear and exhaustion. The goal wasn't just to disgust, it was to grind down an army's resolve, hour by sleepless hour, until fatigue made even the simplest tasks feel impossible. Historical accounts from sieges like Elnwick Castle in 1194 describe defenders timing their waste dumps to coincide with the deepest phases of sleep. The sudden shock of cold, reeking sludge sent soldiers scrambling in panic, their tents and bedrolls ruined, but the real damage was cumulative. Night after night of interrupted rest left attackers sluggish and disoriented, their reaction times slowed, their tempers frayed. Chroniclers noted how entire battalions began making reckless errors, misplacing weapons, stumbling during drills, even firing arrows blindly into the dark at imaginary threats. The psychological toll was worse. Men grew paranoid, jumping at shadows, convinced every rustle in the night signaled another foul deluge. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its asymmetry. While defenders could rotate shifts to stay fresh, attackers had no respite. Their camps were exposed, their sleep schedules at the mercy of unseen enemies above. Some besiegers tried countermeasures, posting extra guards near latrine chutes or digging trenches to divert waste. But defenders simply adapted, switching to silent, gravity-fed pause that gave no warning until it was too late. At Château de Loches in 1223, French garrison records boast of keeping an English army awake for 9 straight nights with alternating shifts of waste dumping teams, a coordinated assault on rest that left enemies mumbling and hollow-eyed by week's end. Fatigue didn't just weaken bodies, it warped judgment. Exhausted soldiers were more likely to misinterpret orders, abandon posts, or turn on each other in frustration. The Siege of Stirling in 1303 saw Scottish defenders use this to devastating effect. After weeks of nightly waste raids, English besiegers began accusing their own comrades of sabotage, their sleep-deprived minds conjuring conspiracies. Desertion spiked as men chose the shame of fleeing over another night of torment. Even knights weren't immune. Chronicles describe noblemen surrendering without a fight, their pride eroded by sheer exhaustion. What made this form of psychological attrition so effective was its invisibility. Unlike a sword wound or a broken bone, sleep deprivation left no visible mark, yet its effects were just as crippling. Defenders understood that breaking an army's spirit didn't always require bloodshed. Sometimes, all it took was denying them the basic human need for rest. By the time dawn broke, attackers weren't just battling castle walls, they were battling their own crumbling minds, and in that fragile state, even the smallest defeat could feel like surrender. The moment castle defenders perfected the art of sewage warfare, besiegers scrambled to adapt because in medieval warfare, every advantage sparked a countermove. Attackers quickly learned to study castle layouts before assault, mapping the telltale stains beneath garderobe chutes to avoid their kill zones. At the siege of Bedford Castle in 1224, English sappers deliberately tunneled beneath latrine outlets, collapsing waste channels before the assault even began. Others fashioned makeshift shields from oiled leather or layered cloth, not to block arrows, but to create slick surfaces that caused waste to slide off rather than soak in. These weren't just practical solutions, they were psychological victories, robbing defenders of their most demoralizing weapon. The most determined besiegers turned sabotage into an art form. Chronicles from the 100 Years' War describe French troops stuffing weighted nets into garderobe chutes during nighttime raids, clogging the passages with debris that required days of dangerous cleanout. At Caerphilly Castle in Wales, attackers lowered soldiers on ropes to stuff iron spikes into waste outlets, jamming them permanently. Some armies even employed Filth scouts, lightning-fast runners who dashed to castle walls during lulls in fighting, hurling sacks of quicklime into moats to neutralize the foul sludge. These weren't acts of desperation but calculated reversals, flipping the script on defenders who thought they held all the dirty tricks. Defenders, of course, responded with innovations of their own. The garrisons of Burgundy began installing hinged iron grates over garderobe openings, easy to lift for normal use, but slammed shut during sieges to block debris. Others designed chutes with multiple branching outlets, so if attackers clogged one, waste could be diverted to another. The real genius emerged in concentric castles like Beaumaris, where inner and outer latrine systems created overlapping fields of filth. Seal one, and the other would still drench you. This escalating arms race transformed castle plumbing from passive infrastructure into dynamic, adaptable weaponry. What's fascinating is how this mirrored broader siegecraft evolution. Just as trebuchets grew more powerful to smash thicker walls, and armor advanced to counter deadlier arrows, sewage systems became increasingly sophisticated to outwit besiegers' countermeasures. By the late Middle Ages, some castles featured false garderobes, dummy chutes designed to lure attackers into wasting time, blocking them while the real waste channels remained hidden. At Malbork Castle in Prussia, engineers even devised a flushing mechanism using diverted rainwater to clear blockages mid-siege. These weren't just improvements, they were declarations that no tactic, no matter how unconventional, would become obsolete without a fight. The legacy of this cat-and-mouse game endures in castle architecture. If you look closely at the weathered stones of medieval fortresses, you'll spot the scars of this silent struggle: patched chutes, reinforced outlets, and strange, angled protrusions that once shielded waste channels from sabotage. Each modification tells a story of ingenuity under pressure, where even the most humiliating weapons drove technological leaps. Because in the end, medieval warfare wasn't just about who had the strongest walls or sharpest swords. It was about who could adapt fastest, whether the challenge came from a trebuchet's payload or a bucket of filth. And sometimes the dirtiest battles spawned the cleverest solutions. The grim ingenuity of medieval sewage warfare didn't vanish with crumbling castles. It evolved, adapting to new battlefields and technologies. Take the star forts of the Renaissance, those angular bastions designed to deflect cannon fire. While their sleek walls looked impenetrable, hidden within them were the same dirty tricks perfected centuries earlier. Engineers at places like Pomonova in Italy or Naarden in the Netherlands built elaborate waste channels into their designs, positioning latrine outlets to rain filth onto anyone attempting to scale the outer defenses. The difference scale. Where medieval garderobes targeted individuals, star forts could drench entire regiments with coordinated dumps from multiple chutes, turning their geometrically perfect kill zones into swamps of humiliation. Even more striking is how these tactics crossed into naval warfare. By the 1700s, British ships blockading French ports would deliberately pump raw sewage into their ballast tanks, then release it near enemy harbors to foul drinking water and spread disease among coastal garrisons. The French retaliated in kind, with one admiral boasting in his memoirs that his fleet had turned the sea itself into a weapon by contaminating tidal estuaries during retreats. This wasn't just spite, it was psychological calculation, forcing enemies to choose between thirst and surrender. The industrial age brought terrifying refinements. During the American Civil War, Confederate troops defending Vicksburg packed explosives with rotting animal parts, creating what survivors called stink shells that showered Union trenches with putrid shrapnel. World War I saw German engineers develop chlorine gas, but its earliest prototypes weren't lethal. They were designed to induce vomiting and panic by mimicking the gag-inducing stench of sewage. One British soldier's diary from the Somme describes how these early gas attacks felt eerily familiar, like the garderobe ambushes of old castles made mechanical. Modern militaries still harness this primal revulsion. Declassified Cold War documents reveal Soviet experiments with olfactory weapons, chemical compounds mimicking human waste to trigger instinctive retreats. More recently, Israeli forces have used skunk spray, a foul-smelling but non-lethal liquid, to disperse crowds by exploiting the same deep-seated disgust medieval defenders relied on. Even riot control tactics sometimes incorporate malodorants, proving that after 800 years, the core principle remains unchanged. Nothing breaks resolve like the assault on dignity. Perhaps the most telling legacy lies in language. Military slang still refers to hopeless positions as in the latrine, while the term biological warfare traces its roots not to plagues, but to those medieval defenders who first weaponized decay. The castles may be ruins now, but their darkest innovation lives on not just in tactics, but in our understanding of how easily the human mind buckles under the weight of shame. Because while weapons grow more advanced, the power of filth to humiliate and horrify remains timeless. Knights prided themselves on being the untouchable elite, gleaming symbols of divine right and martial superiority. Their polished armor, embroidered surcoats, and meticulously groomed war horses weren't just practical gear. They were walking propaganda, physical proof of their God-given dominance over the common ranks. That's exactly why defenders took such vicious delight in drenching them in filth. picture the scene: a mounted knight, his heraldry fluttering, charging toward the castle gates only to be engulfed in a putrid wave from above. The sludge seeped into the joints of his armor, stained his family crest, and clung to his horse's mane. In an instant, the illusion of nobility crumbled. He wasn't a chosen warrior anymore, just another shivering, stinking wretch. This humiliation struck deeper than any sword. Medieval society ran on rigid hierarchy, where a noble's authority hinged on perceived purity and divine favor. Filth wasn't just dirty, it carried the weight of biblical impurity, a sign of moral decay. When common soldiers watched their lords retching and scrambling to wipe waste from their faces, it shattered the myth of their inherent superiority. Chroniclers like Froissart recorded desertions after such incidents, with foot soldiers muttering that if their betters could be reduced to this state, perhaps God wasn't on their side after all. The defenders knew precisely what they were doing. By targeting knights, they weren't just harassing individuals, they were unraveling the entire chain of command. The divide and conquer strategy was brutally effective. At the Siege of Rochester in 1215, English defenders focused their waste dumps on the French vanguard's mounted knights, leaving the infantry relatively untouched. The result: common soldiers, already resentful of noble privileges, began ignoring orders from their soiled commanders. Some even laughed openly as knights struggled to dismount without slipping in the muck. Within days, the French assault collapsed not from lack of strength, but from eroded discipline. The lesson was clear: you couldn't maintain feudal obedience when your leaders smelled like a cesspit. Even the aftermath played into defenders' hands. A knight drenched in filth couldn't simply wash off the shame. Waste clung to chainmail links, festered in boot seams, and left stains no amount of scrubbing could erase. Noblemen forced to burn their ruined garments or abandon ancestral armor faced financial ruin alongside humiliation. At the Siege of Harlech, Welsh defenders boasted that their sewage attacks cost the English nobility more in lost equipment than a year's worth of battles. The psychological toll was worse. Knights who'd endured such degradation often became hesitant in later engagements, their once unshakable confidence replaced by the dread of another indignity. But the real masterstroke was how this tactic exploited existing class tensions. Medieval armies were powder kegs of resentment, with conscripted peasants outnumbering nobles 10 to 1. When defenders made a spectacle of humiliating the elite, they gave voice to every grudge the lower ranks had swallowed for years. Some chronicles describe soldiers refusing to help clean their superiors, or accidentally knocking waste-soaked knights into puddles. A few garrisons, like those at Carcassonne, even taunted besiegers by shouting, "Your lords smell as foul as you now," a calculated jab at the hypocrisy of feudalism. By the late Middle Ages, sewage warfare had become so synonymous with class warfare that some nobles refused to lead assaults altogether. The Duke of Burgundy famously ordered his knights to hang back during the Siege of Calais, forcing commoners to charge first, a move that backfired when the demoralized troops deserted en masse. It was a testament to the tactic's enduring power. After centuries of castles dominating battlefields, their most lasting innovation wasn't stone walls or arrow loops, but the realization that sometimes the quickest way to topple an army was to remind its lowest ranks that their so-called betters weren't so different after all. For centuries, medieval texts described sewage attacks in vague terms, gruesome anecdotes passed down like campfire horror stories. But modern archaeology has turned these whispers into hard evidence. At a dig in Caernarfon Castle, researchers made a chilling discovery: garderobe chutes weren't just haphazardly placed. They were precisely angled, their openings tilted toward common assault routes like staircases and gate approaches. Soil samples told an even darker story. Chemical analysis revealed layers of concentrated human waste mixed with quicklime and decaying organic matter, a toxic cocktail that couldn't have formed naturally. This wasn't accidental overflow, it was a stocked arsenal. The real smoking gun came from moat sediments. At Warwick Castle, core samples extracted from the drained moat showed alternating layers of clean silt and foul, waste-saturated strata. The pattern was unmistakable periods of normal use interrupted by sudden, massive dump events. Radiocarbon dating placed these surges squarely during known sieges, proving defenders didn't just use sewage incidentally. They stockpiled it like ammunition, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash. One sample from the 1288 siege layer contained horsehair and plant fibers, suggesting defenders stuffed waste into sacks or barrels for maximum projectile effect. Historians have pieced together a meticulous timeline from these fragments. Cross-referencing soil data with siege records reveals how tactics evolved. Early Norman keeps show simple waste chutes, but by the 13th century, castles like Dover featured elaborate flush systems, where defenders could release cisterns of water to propel filth farther. At Conway Castle, archaeologists found garderobe chutes with grooves for sliding wooden baffles, crude but effective flow controls that allowed precise targeting. These weren't improvised defenses, they were engineered systems refined through generations of trial and error. Perhaps the most telling find came from a Spanish dig at Almodovar del Rio. Beneath a collapsed latrine chute, researchers uncovered a scribbled diagram scratched into the stone by some long-dead mason. It showed calculations for trajectory angles, with notations in medieval Latin translating to "for maximum shame." This single graffito confirms what archaeology has slowly revealed: medieval sewage warfare wasn't just brutal improvisation. It was mathematics of humiliation, calculated as carefully as any trebuchet's arc. The stones themselves are finally telling the stories parchment dared not record. Medieval battlefields weren't just recorded in chronicles. They were immortalized in song, art, and satire, where sewage warfare became a favorite punchline. Picture a lavishly illustrated manuscript from the 1400s, its margins filled with grinning peasants dumping buckets on flailing knights, or a bawdy tavern ballad mocking a nobleman's retreat, his once fine cloak now brown as a beggar's breeches. These weren't just jokes, they were cultural reckonings, proof that even in an era of chivalric romance, nothing cut through the propaganda like the stench of reality. Take the Chanson de la Merde, a French drinking song that spread like wildfire after the siege of Rouen. Its lyrics gleefully described English knights slipping in their own filth, their heralds singing not of glory but of stains. Manuscripts from the period show illuminations of soldiers scrubbing sewage from their armor alongside biblical scenes of divine punishment, a not-so-subtle hint that such humiliation was God's will. Even tapestries got in on the act. The famous Bayeux Muckery, a lesser-known cousin to the Bayeux Tapestry, depicted Norman invaders dodging waste hurled from Saxon towers, their faces twisted in comical disgust. This mocking tone wasn't accidental. By turning battlefield humiliations into art, commoners reclaimed power from the nobility. A knight drenched in filth couldn't maintain his aura of divine right, not when every peasant in the tavern was cackling about it. Some historians argue these depictions were early propaganda, designed to undermine feudal hierarchies. After all, if a lord could be reduced to a laughingstock by a well-aimed chamber pot, perhaps he wasn't so different from the rest of us. The trope even seeped into religious texts. In the Luttrell Psalter, an illustration shows demons flinging excrement at sinners, a clear nod to siege tactics. Church sermons warned that moral corruption would leave souls besieged by foulness. while morality plays featured villains slipping on metaphorical and sometimes literal waste. The message was universal. Filth wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, social, and deeply subversive. Fast forward to today, and you'll notice a curious silence. Modern military histories gloss over sewage warfare, treating it as a distasteful footnote. Museums display pristine swords and spotless armor, but where are the exhibits on garderobe tactics? This selective memory speaks volumes. We're comfortable celebrating medieval violence, but not the moments when war stripped away pretense and revealed its ugliest truths. Yet those stained manuscripts and raucous ballads tell a different story. That sometimes the most enduring legacy of warfare isn't heroism, but the things that made even heroes human. Nothing played on an attacker's overconfidence quite like a feigned retreat, and medieval defenders turned this classic ruse into a sewage-strewn nightmare. Picture the scene. After hours of brutal fighting, the castle gates suddenly swing open, and defenders appear to panic, scrambling backward in disarray. To the besiegers, it looks like victory until they charge forward, only to hear the sickening splash of boots sinking into a courtyard deliberately flooded with waste. This wasn't just deception, it was psychological warfare at its cruelest, exploiting the universal urge to pursue a fleeing foe while leading them straight into a humiliating trap. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its layers of manipulation. Chroniclers like Jean de Wavrin describe how defenders would stage chaotic retreats, dropping weapons and even feigning injuries to sell the illusion. But the moment attackers surged into the kill zone, hidden teams would release dammed-up latrine flows or tip over vats of rotting waste, transforming the courtyard into a reeking quagmire. The shock was twofold. Not only were attackers suddenly immobilized, waist-deep in filth, but the defenders would then pivot, slamming gates shut and raining arrows from the walls above. What began as a triumphant charge became a slaughterhouse of shame, with knights flailing in sludge while their comrades watched helplessly from outside. One of the most infamous examples comes from the siege of Montségur in 1244. According to Occitan chronicles, Cathar defenders lured French crusaders into a narrow inner bailey with a false retreat, only to flood it with sewage diverted from hidden cisterns. The crusaders, clad in heavy armor, sank like stones, their movements slowed to a crawl as defenders pelted them with rocks and burning pitch. The chronicle notes that more men drowned in the filth than died by weapons, a detail deliberately emphasized to compound the horror. Survivors reported the stench clung to them for weeks, a walking advertisement of their humiliation. What made these traps so devastating was their psychological precision. Medieval warriors were conditioned to view retreat as weakness, their bloodlust peaking at the sight of a fleeing enemy. Defenders weaponized this instinct, using it to draw opponents into spaces where conventional weapons were useless. A sword couldn't cut through sewage, and armor became a liability when weighed down by sludge. Even worse, the public nature of the humiliation often witnessed by both sides turned individual defeats into collective demoralization. Accounts from the siege of Kenilworth describe English knights refusing to advance after witnessing their comrades flounder in waste, fearing not death but disgrace. The tactic's legacy endured because it preyed on something deeper than pride, the human brain's hardwired revulsion to filth. Modern studies show disgust triggers faster than fear, bypassing logic and triggering primal avoidance. Medieval defenders didn't need science to understand this. They saw it in the way even the bravest soldiers froze when drenched in waste. By coupling false retreats with sewage traps, they didn't just win battles, they rewired their enemies' instincts, making every future charge hesitate. And in warfare, hesitation is often the deadliest weakness of all. modern science reveals something medieval commanders knew instinctively. Disgust isn't just a reaction. It's a survival mechanism wired deep in the human brain. Researchers have pinpointed the insular cortex, a region that lights up when we encounter rotting food, bodily waste, or disease cues. This isn't cultural conditioning, it's biology. The visceral recoil from filth kept our ancestors from eating spoiled meat or drinking contaminated water. And in medieval warfare, defenders exploited this primal programming with terrifying precision. When they drenched attackers in sewage, they weren't just causing discomfort. They were hijacking neural pathways evolved over millennia, triggering a panic response no amount of training could override. What's fascinating is how this aligns with contemporary psychology. Studies show disgust operates faster than conscious thought. Within milliseconds, the brain screams danger before logic can intervene. Medieval soldiers didn't just dislike being covered in waste. Their bodies reacted as if poisoned. Pupils dilated, hearts raced, and muscles tensed to flee. Commanders didn't need textbooks to grasp this. They saw it in the way seasoned warriors forgot their drills, clawing at fouled armor like animals trying to escape a trap. The same instinct that makes us jerk our hand from a hot stove made knights abandon siege ladders mid-climb, their brains prioritizing survival over honor. The parallels go deeper. Modern military psychologists note that disgust-based weapons like malodorants used in riot control work precisely because they bypass rational resistance. Just as medieval garrisons timed waste dumps to coincide with assaults, modern forces deploy stink bombs during critical moments to shatter focus. The U.S. Army's non-lethal weapons program even classifies foul smells as cognitive interrupts, acknowledging their power to override discipline. It's the same principle medieval defenders mastered: overwhelm the senses and the mind follows. Yet medieval warfare added a cruel twist absent in Lab's social shame. While disgust is universal, its psychological weight varies by context. For a knight whose identity hinged on purity and divine favor, being drenched in filth wasn't just physically repulsive, it felt like spiritual contamination. Modern experiments confirm this effect. When test subjects are told a foul odor symbolizes moral failure, their stress hormones spike higher than when the stench is framed as harmless. Defenders weaponized this duality, ensuring every sewage attack carried the implicit message: you are unclean, unworthy, condemned. The grim irony, these tactics prefigured modern biowarfare by centuries. Today's militaries study medieval sieges to understand how fear of contamination can cripple morale faster than bullets. When the Pentagon simulates biological attacks, they measure not just infection rates, but the panic induced by perceived exposure. The same terror defenders ignited by flinging waste into enemy wells. The science has advanced, but the lesson remains. In warfare, the most potent weapons often target the mind, not the body. And few things breach human psychology as ruthlessly as the primal, inescapable horror of filth. Summer sieges transformed castle sewage from a nuisance into a weapon of mass demoralization, nature itself becoming an unwitting ally to defenders. When temperatures soared, waste festered at an alarming rate, its stench thickening into a visible haze that clung to everything. Imagine attacking a castle in July, your nostrils assaulted by a rotting fug that seemed to crawl under your skin, growing stronger with every passing hour. Medieval commanders weren't just aware of this effect, they orchestrated it, timing their defenses to exploit the seasons like conductors of a grotesque symphony. The science behind this tactic was brutally simple. Heat accelerates decomposition, turning stagnant moats into bacterial breeding grounds and amplifying the reek of dumped waste exponentially. At the Siege of Albi in 1282, chroniclers described French defenders holding their sewage reserves until a heat wave struck, then unleashing torrents into the dry moat. The result, a putrid miasma so potent it drove Provençal troops to abandon their siege engines, gagging as the sun baked the sludge into a choking vapor. The defenders didn't just rely on weapons, they weaponized the weather itself. Disease became the silent partner in this grim strategy. Summer's warmth didn't just intensify odors, it supercharged the risk of dysentery, cholera, and typhus. Garrisons like those at Carcassonne kept meticulous logs of wind patterns, dumping waste upwind of enemy camps so the breeze carried plague straight into their midst. Records from the Siege of Malta in 1565 revealed defenders stockpiling waste in shaded cisterns during spring, knowing the summer sun would ferment it into a biological time bomb. When the Order of St. John finally hurled these reserves onto Ottoman besiegers, the resulting outbreak crippled their ranks faster than any cannonade. Timing was everything. Savvy defenders let attackers exhaust themselves in spring marches, only to unleash their foulest tactics when the mercury peaked. The Welsh at Harlech Castle perfected this art, waiting until August's dog days to clog nearby streams with animal carcasses, knowing dehydration would force enemies to drink tainted water. The psychological toll was devastating. Opposing armies began associating summer campaigns not with glory, but with feverish agonies and humiliating retreats. By the 14th century, some mercenary companies demanded double pay for summer sieges, a tacit admission that sewage warfare had rewritten the rules of engagement. What made this environmental manipulation so revolutionary was its inevitability. Unlike arrows or boiling oil, no shield could block the creeping dread of summer's heat, amplifying every foul stench. Attackers might brace for battle, but they couldn't outrun the knowledge that each passing day would make the air thicker, the diseases deadlier, and their shame more inescapable. Defenders didn't just hold castles, they wielded the very seasons as weapons, proving that in medieval warfare, sometimes the most devastating attacks came not from human hands, but from nature turned against itself. Nothing shattered the fragile truce of siege negotiations faster than a poisoned gift. Picture exhausted attackers, months into a brutal standoff, finally receiving word that the castle's defenders were ready to discuss terms. As a show of goodwill, the garrison might send out baskets of fresh bread or casks of wine, only for besiegers to discover, too late, that these offerings were laced with laxatives, rotten meat, or even deadly nightshade. This wasn't just deception, it was psychological sabotage, turning what should have been a path to peace into another layer of warfare. The brilliance and cruelty of this tactic lay in its timing. After weeks of starvation and tension, even seasoned commanders let their guard down when surrender seemed imminent. Historical accounts from the Siege of Antioch describe crusaders jubilantly feasting on gifts of spiced meats, only to collapse hours later in agonizing cramps. The defenders hadn't just bought time, they'd sown chaos, leaving attackers too sick to fight while rumors of betrayal spread through the ranks. Worse still, the act tainted all future negotiations. Once burned, besiegers became paranoid, rejecting genuine offers of truce out of fear. What made these betrayals so devastating was their ripple effect. In an era where honor still governed warfare, fake surrenders crossed an invisible line. Chroniclers noted how armies that fell victim to such tricks often responded with disproportionate brutality, slaughtering entire garrisons after eventual victories, convinced no terms could be trusted. The Siege of Besiegers in 1209 turned especially bloody after defenders allegedly poisoned a peace offering, hardening the attackers' resolve to leave no survivors. This wasn't just tactical, it was cultural, eroding the already tenuous rules of medieval conflict. Yet for defenders, the gamble sometimes paid off. At Château de Puivert in 1322, a single tainted cask of wine delayed an assault just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The attackers, decimated by dysentery, abandoned the siege entirely. Such successes came at a cost, though. Word traveled fast among medieval armies, and castles known for poisoned gifts faced harsher reprisals. Some besiegers adopted gruesome countermeasures, forcing defenders to eat portions of their own offerings before accepting terms. The legacy of these deceptions lingers in modern military ethics. Even today, the Geneva Convention explicitly bans perfidious surrender, a direct descendant of those medieval betrayals. Because while swords and arrows fade, the scars of broken trust endure far longer. Defenders who played this card didn't just win battles, they rewrote the psychology of warfare, proving that sometimes the most dangerous weapons weren't blades or bows, but the corrosive power of doubt. Medieval chronicles tell a curious story. Whenever sewage rained down on besiegers, blame often fell not on the castle's engineers or commanders, but on its women. Historical accounts from sieges like Montségur and Béziers describe hags or witch-like figures hurling filth from the walls, their cackles echoing as attackers recoiled. This wasn't just battlefield gossip, it was a deliberate narrative twist revealing how deeply sexism shaped siege storytelling. Women defending their homes became monstrous in the eyes of chroniclers, their actions framed not as strategy, but as something dark and unnatural. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Male defenders using boiling oil or arrows were praised for ingenuity, but women employing waste tactics were painted as grotesque. A 13th century account of the Siege of Toulouse describes defenders led by a noblewoman named Berengaria, who allegedly orchestrated a sewage trap that routed French forces. Yet rather than commend her tactics, the chronicler fixates on her shrill voice and unkempt hair, implying her success stemmed from hysteria, not skill. Similar tales emerge from German sieges, where washerwomen dumping laundry water on attackers were recast as hellish brewers of filth. The message was clear: when men used filth, it was tactics; when women did, it was witchcraft. This bias bled into legal consequences. After the fall of Château de Montelou in 1321, surviving women were interrogated not just for heresy, but for their role in unnatural defenses, specifically pouring waste on inquisitors. Records show these women faced harsher punishments than male soldiers, accused of violating God's order by fighting dirty. Even in victory, female defenders couldn't win. At the Welsh castle of Castell y Barra, a garrison of women and children held off Edward I's forces by flinging excrement from the walls. When the castle fell, English scribes omitted their bravery entirely, instead inventing tales of them brewing poisoned filth in cauldrons like storybook witches. The real tragedy lies in what these distortions erased. Archaeological evidence at sites like Carcassonne reveals women were often siege engineers maintaining garderobe systems, calculating waste stockpiles, and even designing diversion channels. Their contributions were systemic, not supernatural, yet male chroniclers, uncomfortable with women excelling in warfare, rewrote their roles as mystical or malicious. The same society that praised knights for chivalry couldn't fathom women matching their ruthlessness without demonic aid. This gendered smear campaign had lasting consequences. By the Renaissance, the trope was so entrenched that even fictional sieges featured hag defenders. Shakespeare's Henry V borrows from these stereotypes when French citizens mock the English by dumping chamber pots, a scene played for laughs, but rooted in real medieval slander. The irony is palpable. Women who weaponized waste to protect their homes were remembered not as heroes, but as harpies, their legacy fouled by the very biases they fought against. In the end, medieval sewage warfare didn't just reveal the ingenuity of defenders, it exposed the filth lurking in the chronicler's own pens. In the medieval mind, filth wasn't just dirt, it was damnation made visible. The church had long preached that cleanliness mirrored godliness, while waste symbolized sin's corruption. Defenders weaponized this belief, turning sewage dumps into twisted sermons. When waste cascaded down castle walls, it wasn't merely a tactical move, it was a declaration that God himself had judged the attackers unworthy. Chroniclers of the Siege of Antioch describe crusaders crossing themselves in horror as filth splattered their banners, interpreting it as divine retribution for their sins. The psychological effect was profound. Warriors who'd charge unflinching into arrow volleys hesitated under the reign of putrefaction, fearing it signaled heaven's disfavor. This spiritual dread was carefully cultivated. Defenders at Carcassonne chanted psalms while dumping waste, framing each deluge as an act of holy purification. In one chilling account from the Albigensian Crusade, besiegers reported seeing priests on the battlements sprinkling foul water like unholy baptism, shouting that it would wash the heresy from their souls. The symbolism cut deep. Attacking a castle wasn't just a military risk anymore, it became a gamble with salvation. Even the act of slipping in sewage took on ominous meaning. Medieval bestiaries compared sinners to pigs wallowing in muck, so when knights fell face first into waste, it wasn't just embarrassing, it felt like a parable come to life. The omen culture of the time amplified this terror. Soldiers scrutinized battlefield signs with superstitious intensity, a raven's flight, the direction of smoke, even the shape of spilled wine. Sewage attacks played into this perfectly. At the siege of Château Gaillard, French defenders timed their dumps to coincide with a solar eclipse, leaving English troops convinced the sky itself darkened in revulsion. Other garrisons mixed animal entrails into waste, knowing attackers would read them like pagan auguries. One Welsh chronicle describes besiegers finding a half-rotted sheep's heart in the filth, an unmistakable death omen in Celtic tradition before promptly abandoning their positions. Religious rhetoric gave defenders plausible deniability too. When church officials protested the use of such tactics, castle garrisons argued they were merely returning sinners to their natural state. A grim letter from the Bishop of Lincoln even scolds a nobleman for complaining about sewage attacks, reminding him that filth befits those who wage unjust war. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on besiegers. The Lollard preacher John Ball famously mocked knights who recoiled from waste while ignoring the moral rot of their deeds, asking, "Why fear the muck without when you carry it within?" Yet logic rarely overrides instinct. However much attackers scoffed, the visceral link between filth and sin kept its power, a testament to how effectively medieval warfare blurred the lines between the physical and the spiritual. The legacy of this symbolism echoes in surprising places. Modern archaeologists have uncovered garderobe chutes carved with crosses or biblical verses, suggesting some defenders saw waste disposal as sacramental. At Crac des Chevaliers, one latrine's lintel bears an inscription from Job: "My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust." Such finds reveal the dark duality of medieval faith, a world where even excrement could be a vessel for divine judgment, and every castle wall doubled as a pulpit preaching the wages of war. What began as simple stone chutes for waste disposal became some of the most feared weapons in medieval warfare, a transformation as ingenious as it was grotesque. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were masterclasses in psychological combat, where defenders weaponized disgust itself. The real brilliance lay in the asymmetry of it all. Why waste precious arrows when a single bucket of filth could crumble an army's resolve? Medieval engineers didn't just build castles, they designed nightmares, turning every garderobe into a potential ambush point and every moat into a festering trap. This was warfare stripped of pretense, where the raw power of humiliation trumped even the sharpest sword. Modern audiences might dismiss these tactics as crude, but that misses the point entirely. These strategies were calculated, refined over generations, and rooted in a deep understanding of human psychology. The same primal revulsion that makes us recoil from rotten food today made knights flee from sewage-covered battlements 800 years ago. Defenders didn't just exploit weakness, they rewired instincts, weaponizing shame in ways that still resonate in modern conflict. So the next time you walk through a medieval castle's ruins, look closer. Those innocuous-looking chutes and drains, they're silent witnesses to a forgotten arms race where the most mundane features became instruments of terror. History isn't just written in treaties and battles, it's etched into the very stones, waiting for those willing to dig deeper. If this glimpse into the dark ingenuity of the past fascinated you, imagine what other secrets lie buried. Hit subscribe and let's keep unearthing the stories that redefine how we see history, one unexpected weapon at a time.